All right, hi everybody, it's Adam Duff and welcome to my latest tutorial. Now I'm going to jump straight into it because we've got a lot of information to cover. However, I want to mention a few important points. The first is the fact that this is both a beginner and an advanced tutorial. So if there's information that you're familiar with, like keyboard shortcuts and brush settings, so on and so forth, feel free to skip ahead. However, I want everybody to be able to follow along. The second thing is it's essential if you're newer to digital painting that you work with a pressure sensitive pen. If you're trying to draw with a mouse, I strongly discourage you from doing that because the one of the most important features of being able to draw digitally is working on a tablet that can capture pressure sensitivity. So if you don't have one, go on eBay, pick up a cheap one for 40, 50 bucks. You don't need to go and buy a top of the line one, but it is essential that you do have one. The third thing is just to mention that my headset went halfway through the tutorial. So there's a few clips that you might find have a bit of a buzz to it because I didn't realize my mic was starting to die on me. Okay, so it's not the end of the world, but do be aware of that's where the buzz is coming from. Your speakers aren't busted. Okay, so to jump straight into it, first thing I'm going to talk about is brushes. And to a newer digital painter, you might have discovered the fantastic world of custom downloadable brushes. I discourage you from doing that because if you do so, you're going to find yourself lost in a haystack of brushes that you don't know what to do with. It's far easier and quicker and more effective to customize your own, and I'm going to be showing you later on how to do that. Okay? The only one you need to worry about is this default round brush up here, and a few simple settings that I'm going to take you through at this point at this part of the tutorial. Do be aware as well, for more beginner artists as well, that you can pause and write down some of these useful keyboard shortcuts for navigating around your screen, moving around, changing screen modes, opening and closing documents, that type of idea. Okay, but let's jump straight into brushes and brush settings because I know that this is a question that you probably have pending. I receive lots of messages based on what type of brushes I use and how I set them. And at the end of this tutorial, at the very end, I have links to my free tutorials that you can find on YouTube that cover many other topics as well. So feel free to go and check them out. So if we're in our brush tool, the first thing that we need to, B for brush, by the way, B as in Bobby, the first thing you need to know is how to control brush size. And those are the left and right brackets, just to the right of your P key, P as in potato. So the left bracket will make my brush smaller. The right bracket will make it larger. The next thing is brush hardness, the difference between having a sharp brush or something that feels more like an airbrush or spray paint. Okay, and those are the same two keyboard shortcuts, the left and the right bracket. However, you hold down Shift. Shift is also known as a modifier. Shift, Control, Alt, they're all modifier keys because they modify your keyboard shortcuts. So if I hold down Shift and tap my left bracket 4 or 5 times, it'll give me an airbrush. And if I hold down Shift and tap my right bracket 4 or 5 times, the same bracket I used for brush size, it'll give me a hard tip. The next two settings are opacity and flow, which if you're in your brush tool, you'll see this menu pop up here on the top. And opacity and flow can be controlled with a slider like this. Okay. Now opacity refers to how much paint is coming out of your brush every time you make a brush stroke. And right now it's set to 100%. This is 100% opacity. However, if I turn this opacity down to, let's say, 10%, only 10% of that paint is coming out. So it's very transparent paint, as if I mixed it with water or I'm painting lighter. Okay. However, you don't want to keep going into this you don't want to use a slider. You want to be able to do this by hand with a quick keyboard shortcut. And the keyboard shortcut are all of the numbered keys above your keyboard, above the letters on your keyboard, between 1 and 9, including 0. So if I hit 5, it'll give me 50% opacity. 9, 90% opacity. 1, 10% opacity. 0 is 100%. And I can flip through those very quickly and not have to worry about these sliders up here at the top. So that's opacity. Flow, on the other hand, refers to the brush tip feel, whether it feels more feathered and organic versus something that's more digital, right? And that's not to be confused with brush hardness, okay? And you'll see what I'm talking about. It's a subtle difference, but it's an important difference. At 100% flow, I'm getting this very digital, sharp line. However, if I set my flow down to around 25%, you'll notice that my brush tip feel feels a little bit more feathered and organic, okay? The keyboard shortcut for that is are the same numbered keys at the top. However, I'm holding down the same modifier that I did to switch between my brush size and brush hardness, the Shift key. Okay, so if I hold down Shift 4, it's going to give me 40%. Shift 8 is 80%. Shift 1, 10%. Shift 0 is 100% flow. And I can flip between them that easily, that quickly. Okay. The last two settings, the only last two settings you need to worry about are shape dynamics and other dynamics. And those can only be accessed through your brush menu. And the brush menu can be open and closed by hitting the F5 key, function 5. Okay? Shape dynamics controls how thick or thin your line is depending on how hard you press. So if I press very gently, I'll get a thin line. If I press hard, I'll get a thick line. Other dynamics controls the opacity of my line depending on how hard I press. So if I press very gently, I'll get a very transparent line, and if I press hard, I'll get an opaque line. And naturally, I can, of course, mix any of these settings I played with together to create different effects. So if I turn shape and other dynamics on, then I can have a thin and transparent line, and then just by pressing harder, I can get a thick and opaque line. All right. Now, if I want to erase everything I just drew, confided I'm on its own layer, I'm on a separate layer, then I just do Control A to select all, hit the backspace to delete everything, and then do Control D to deselect. Now, for the first part of this painting, I'm going to, because you want to know how these brushes are used in context, I want to create a pen tip, like a brush or a pencil, something for sketching. So I turn shape and other dynamics on, I have my opacity and flow turned up to 100%, and I made my brush small. That's it. And this way I can draw at my own leisure. If I wanted to, for instance, have a lighter line, I didn't want to have something that was too opaque, then of course I could turn my opacity down to, let's say, 50%. And here I'll draw a little more gently, or maybe even 30%, or 10%. So I'm drawing very gently. Okay? That's it. Now, at the beginning of the first part of this tutorial, you'll notice that I'm not going to show as much of the painting process. I'm actually going to demonstrate more because it's more important that you understand what's going on in my head during the production of this painting, because the drawing itself is repetitive, and you already will understand how I drew it. I just wanted to give you a quick excerpt of the drawing process itself so that you could see how my lines started coming down to create this shape. However, what's more important is that you understand what I'm doing. So there's going to be a little bit more demonstration and explanation at the beginning. However, as we progress forward through the painting, you're going to watch more of the painting process and how it unfolds. Okay, so let's continue. Now, at this point in the tutorial, I have to decide how I want to draw this. And in order to decide how, I have to decide first what. And in this case, we're doing an ancient old yew tree, an old gnarled yew tree. It's very organic, it's very bumpy, and I want to capture some of that energy in the drawing itself. In order for you to understand my headspace and how I decided to approach this, I actually put myself in the headspace of a classical cartoon animator. Remember, that's my background, right? So I coined that idea from classical animation. And the two fundamental techniques used in classical animation, classical meaning traditional, hand-drawn, like Beauty and the Beast or Tarzan or Looney Tunes, that type of idea. The two different techniques are straight ahead animation, where you start at one image and you draw image 1 and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, so on and so forth. And the alternative to that is key animation or pose-to-pose animation, where before you do all of those in-between images, you first establish where your animation is going to start, where it's going to end, and then you add all the in-betweens in the middle. Now, the advantage of straight ahead is the fact that you're creating something that's fun, it's organic, it's unpredictable. You can kind of lose track of your original idea and go off in some strange tangent that ends up creating something that's fun. The disadvantage is that it can be technically weak. It can lack form, proportion, volumes, that type of idea. In the case of key animation, you're creating a solid framework, so you know where it's starting, where it's ending. You can keep track of your proportions, your perspective, your volumes, all of those things. However, it can look a little bit robotic as a movement and lack a little bit of energy and spirit to it. So animators have learned to combine both techniques, both straight ahead to create something that's fun and interesting and entertaining, and key animation where they were working on something that was a little bit more technically demanding, where they needed to be able to follow a certain guideline. Now, drawing can follow exactly the same methodology, can use the same techniques. In the case of technical drawing, I want to establish what my three-dimensional forms are first. So let's say if I'm drawing the trunk of a tree, say I'll draw the trunk of a tree here. I'll do a cylinder for the tree, like that. I'm going to do it very loosely, and then I might do a little bit of a tapered cylinder for one of the branches, and then I can do another cylinder attached to that one to create the other branch, and so on and so forth. Okay? And you'll notice that I also draw through. Like we know, for instance, in the end, that we're not going to see this. We're not going to see this. We're not necessarily going to see that either. I can erase that after. But what I've done is I've created a nice, solid, three-dimensional form. And when it comes to applying lighting and shading to an object like this, it can be far more easier to read because I can understand those three-dimensional forms better. The disadvantage is the fact that I'm thinking within a box, right? So I might lose some of that nice, organic, natural feel to something, like for instance, working on an ancient yew tree, or drawing hair or fabric, something that can be loose and be a little bit more energetic. So the alternative to that would be straight ahead drawing, where essentially I put my pen down in a spot and I allow my branch to go off in some weird, bumpy, different direction. And yes, I did have coffee this morning, but not that much. This is actually deliberate. Now, in order to finish off this form, if I just keep going straight ahead and I'm not paying attention to anything in particular, I could very easily create a form that lacks geometric form. Let's say if I just came in like that and I just finished it off like that. I don't feel the three-dimensional form here. I'm losing some of that technical solidity that I had with technical drawing, right? So what I'm going to do is use this line as my guide, and I'm going to try to respect that to a certain degree. I can respect it loosely, right? I don't have to respect it perfectly, but I want to respect it well enough so that I'm starting to establish a three-dimensional form that's a little bit more believable. As it is right now, however, I still don't feel the three-dimensional form. It's still a little bit flat, right? Because I only have two lines to establish. I'm only doing the contour. I want to start understanding what's happening inside this object and how it's broken down. So depending on your comfort with volume, depending on how advanced, how much practice you've had with volume and perspective, this is something you can do in your head, or you can physically draw it. Because remember, in a painting, that line drawing is essentially going to disappear, depending on how you approach it. In my case, in this painting, my line drawing is not going to exist to the end, so I don't care if it's a little bit rough and scrappy. I know that it's not good. I know I'm going to delete it and paint over it in the end. But in the case where you actually want to incorporate line drawing into your painting, which artists do all the time, you'd want to eventually, after all this is done, come over on a new layer and paint in over it to do a nice clean line. Okay, but in this case, we're not going to worry about that. I'm just going to create let's say this is my main branch, and then I'm going to start another branch here, and I'm going to do a few little twists and turns like that with this branch, like that. And then I'm going to use that line as a guide to do this finishing line. Okay. Now this feels a lot more organic, doesn't it? This actually feels like an old gnarled tree. But we haven't quite established what our three-dimensional form is yet. So that's where you can come back into your drawing, okay? And you can physically draw in these ellipses. How this shape is going to connect. You can add a few ellipses where you feel it's needed to help establish the actual direction of these branches. That type of idea. You can physically draw them in. There's absolutely no rules against doing this as long as you understand what's going on. That's what's important, right? I'm going to make sure I establish where this branch is connecting here, and then it's going to twist around, and then it might come towards us a little bit more. And here it's going to start bending away, that type of idea. And I can do the same thing for the whole trunk here. I'm going to physically draw in all of these different ellipses. That type of idea. Now I can actually start to sense this three-dimensional form. So when I come in and I start to draw in details like some of the folds and bumps in the tree, I'm going to respect this ellipse. This line is actually respecting that ellipse. And furthermore, if I continue here and I want that branch to connect to a tree, for instance, then I'm going to have a nice ellipse here. And let's say I have the actual trunk of my tree that goes like this. then I'm going to want to respect that ellipse when I'm coming in to paint in where that actual branch is going to connect, type of idea. Okay. I've basically combined technical and straight ahead drawing techniques together to create something that was organic, yet it was at the same time geometrically sound. I can now read this and say, okay, now I know exactly how I want my lighting to fall over this object. I can see and sense these three-dimensional forms very clearly, and that's what's important, okay? So that's straight ahead and technical drawing combined. Now, if you actually compare the two, you can see that this feels more like an organic tree. This looks like it's probably made out of toilet paper rolls or something like that. This doesn't have that nice, natural, unpredictable feel. And the human eye enjoys stuff like this. When your audience are looking at your artwork, they're going to appreciate these bumps because it allows their imagination to get involved as well. They can follow it along, and people will find different areas that they enjoy more than others. You can leave a little bit more to the discretion of your audience to decide where they want to enjoy your painting rather than just saying, okay, this is where it is. It's all here. Now, at a certain point, you're also going to notice that I want to edit. I want to transform one of these branches at a certain point. I'm doing an archway, and I wanted to transform it. At this particular phase of the drawing, it's very easy to do. I'm working on one layer. I'm only working with a line drawing, and I know that I can transform it. And even if it gets a little bit blurred and messed up a bit, I'm not panicking about it, as long as I have a clear line guide like this. Okay? And the way I did that was to hit L as in Larry for the lasso tool. I can also access it by clicking on this button here, okay? And you notice that I have a selection of two different lasso tools. I can have the free draw lasso tool or the polygon lasso tool. I'm gonna go with the free draw one. And here I can physically select my branch. Now with a selection like this, you'll notice that it's not really hugging my drawing. So if I do a transformation, it's actually gonna transform all of this space too. I want it to be a more accurate transformation. So what I can actually do is just go press V for V as in Victor for the move tool or the arrow. I can click on this arrow up here up at the top, and then I can nudge my drawing by nudging it one point by hitting the right arrow key. And what that does is it makes my selection snap to my drawing. And then if I want, I can hit the left button so that I can put it back in place. By nudging it, I'm making that selection snap to my image. Now, if I do Control T, T as in Tommy, if I do Control T, now when I transform, it's actually hugging. It's actually really only going to move the pixels that are selected. However, I don't just want to do a free transform like this. Oops, my bad. I didn't flatten. If you want to merge layers down, because you notice I did these on separate layers, then I just do Control E to merge down. Now it's all on one layer, see? Now I hit V, as in Victor, I nudge it to the right and then nudge it to the left. Now it's hugging my drawing. I do Control T, but I don't want to just do a free transform like this. I don't want to transform it globally. I actually want to warp this branch around in different ways. And the way you can do that is either by going to Edit, Transform, and then selecting Warp, or the shortcut for that is just to right-click directly on your transformation. And then you hit Warp. I actually have my stylus pen, my drawing pen, set to the right click on one of my buttons. I hit Warp, and now I can physically go in and transform this drawing exactly the way I want it to move, like that. And I can warp this branch around. Maybe I want this branch to come in a little bit more, that type of idea. Like that. And then I hit Enter when I'm happy with it, and then I do Control D, as in David, to deselect. Now if I do Control, Alt, and Z all at the same time, and I tap Z a few times, and I go back to my original, and then I let go, and then I just do Control Z, I can flip back and forth between then and now. So I can go to my transformation, and then back to the way it was originally, and I can physically see my change. And I can use that at that point to judge whether or not I'm happy with this transformation or forget it altogether and just stick with it the way it was before. Okay? That's just by continually hitting. If you just hit Control Z, it's going to do undo, redo, undo, redo. It's going to keep flipping back and forth. However, if I do Control Alt Z, I can do multiple undos, as many as I'm allowed in the memory of my computer, as far as I set Photoshop. Now, the only other quick tip I want to give you as far as making a selection is concerned is, like I said, you have two different types of selection tools. You have the free draw select tool, and you have your polygon select tool, in which case you have to click to make your selection. Now, the advantage to a free draw selection tool is that it's fast, okay? If I go into my free draw selection tool, it's fast. I can do a quick selection like this. With the case of polygons, it's slower. However, if I want to really get into specific little tight corners, generally find that doing the polygon lasso tool is a little bit more accurate. I could really take my time and make sure I got that selection exactly the way I want it to. However, you might find it a little bit annoying to have to keep flipping back and forth between the two. So there's an actual quick, very handy shortcut for that. If you're in the regular free draw lasso tool, and at a certain point you want to convert into your polygon lasso tool, then you just have to hold down Alt, and it'll convert it into the polygon lasso tool. You can make your very specific selection, and then when you're happy, you let go of Alt and keep drawing. Quick tip. So that's it. That's how I'm going to be approaching the entire drawing phase of this painting. So let's move on. Now this part is time-lapsed quite a bit. I believe it's like 500 to 600% faster than I normally draw, just because we already know where we're going, and I just want you to see how I get this sketch going. And in a moment, you're actually going to see me jump ahead to the last phase of this sketch. What's important at this point to mention is two things. The first is put a line down on a paper. A lot of people take the fixing or editing part of a drawing for granted. They think it's, I screwed up. You didn't screw up. 99% of the time, get a line down on the paper, get something started, and then you can move it around it and transform it the way a sculptor would to create the shape that you're looking for. That's one of the big advantages of being able to work digitally like this, is the fact that you can edit your drawing at your leisure. So I'm just creating these very nice organic bumps and twists and turns in the trunk, and then I travel around the page to create these branches, and I'm paying close attention to the feeling that I get looking at image references, because on my second screen I have image references there to give me ideas on how I can twist these branches in a different way. And that brings us to the second subject, which is image references. Image references are something that I use all the time to give me new ideas, to open my mind up to different things I wouldn't have thought of, because the world is a huge place with a lot of information out there, so I'll never expect myself to know everything. I think it's a silly thought, and nature has so many things to teach. There's no reason why I should try to bluff it. But when I use image references, most of the time I use image references as a guide for my mind. I might have 6 or 7 different image references sitting on my screen at the same time, and I'm just kind of glancing over it to think, oh, okay, maybe I can twist a branch around this way, or I like the way these branches all tilt upwards, or I like the way this one dips down to the ground. And in my head, I knew I wanted to do this archway, right? So I looked up some image references on how the side branches on these ancient trees dip down to the ground. But the drawing itself, what I'm sketching in front of you, I'm doing myself. These are my own shape branches. I'm not trying to draw exactly what I see, because that would just take me forever. The only thing I had in my mind was I knew I wanted to have that archway, because that's going to be our focal point in the drawing. That's where we're going to put our character. All right? So this is it. This is our sketch. Now at this phase, we're starting the blocking. Blocking basically means blocking in the basic background color and shape of the object. And the two things I generally remember during this phase is, one, I work low value, so darker color, and very, very low saturation. Very often artists even start completely in grayscale. They don't even touch color at this point. However, for this particular painting, I'm going to start with color, but very, very low saturation. And the reason I'm starting low saturation is if you start with something that's very bright and saturated right away, that can actually limit your opportunities to be able to balance saturations later on in your painting. You can find that it's just you create a painting that's far too obnoxious right off the bat, and later on when you want to do minor tweaks, you can start finding that it's hard to at that point, where it's generally easier, especially when you're first starting with color, to work with a very low saturation and slowly you build yourself up towards the end. Okay. Now during this phase, like I said, we're going to be working on the blocking. So we have our line layer, and generally you set your line layer to multiply. And then under that, I'm going to create a new layer, set to normal. And here, I'm going to set my brush to be a soft, I'm going to turn my hardness all the way down, and I'm going to turn shape dynamics off. Okay. I'm going to set my opacity and flow to about 160, as you can see here. And here, I'm going to pick a color. Let's say it's about in this reddish brown. And if you notice here, this would be completely gray, desaturated. I'm just going to pull it off a little bit. So there's the slightest saturation of color in there. Very, very subtle, almost nothing. And here, I'm just going to go, I'm just going to paint it all in real fast, just like that. Okay, but I can be a little bit tighter, like I can paint here, and if I'm doing the smaller brushes, I can just go like that, give me less to clean up after. Okay, and that's it. Okay, once that's done, which takes about 4 seconds, as you can see, I go into my eraser tool by hitting E. Okay, and the eraser tool, just to mention at this point, it's important to say, eraser tool and the brush tool are identical. They have all the same settings. The only difference between eraser and brush is the fact that the eraser subtracts information and the brush adds information. So I'm going to go into my eraser tool, and here I'm going to set my hardness up to a hard edge. I'm going to keep my other dynamics on. Generally, 90% of the time I keep other dynamics on. And I'm going to turn shape dynamics off. Why? Because I don't want to worry about my line thickness. I just want to be able to follow and erase around this edge without worrying about having to fix things and making unpredictable size variations in my line. I just want to be able to follow this very cleanly. Okay, my opacity and flow are set to 160. And here I'm just going to come outside and I'm going to erase everything like that. Just going to follow around the edge. Now, had I had shape dynamics on, this is what would have happened. Let's actually just change. Okay. This is what happens. Okay. This can happen, which can be a pain in the butt, right? So it's a lot easier just to keep your shape dynamics off, so you don't have to worry about that. And you get a nice controlled line. It goes all the way around. And you continue around the entire shape like this. When you get into tight little corners, like a corner here, I'll come here like this, and then I'll just shrink my brush down, and then I'll make it bigger again as I come back into the open, just to save myself from having to do this. I don't want to have to do that. I just want to have a large brush and I want to sweep over it and clean it all up in one shot. And this saves you, it's a time saver. Okay. The advantage of blocking in this way is because my alternative to that would be to take a brush, a hard-edged brush, and paint it all in. I have to do that. And I have to keep thinking about everything that's on the inside. Okay. And it's actually more time consuming to find all those little subtle bumps. Get those little nooks and crannies on the inside. And this actually costs you a little bit more time. The other advantage of doing this is I find it's a nice technique to give you a nice finish. You get a nice sharp edge like that. Get a nice sharp edge all around the contour, and at certain ends where you can let it fade off, and it's an actual technique you can use to create a nice finish to your drawing. You have a nice sharp edge, and then it has this little bit of a gradient, a little bit of a fall off. That's nice. It's a technique, it's not the technique, but it's a nice way to approach it. All right. Now, when that's all said and done, this is what we end up with. Something like this. Okay. We have our line layer. And then under that, I create my blocking layer. If we have them both together, this is what we end up having. And I did this entire tree exactly the same way I did this. Nothing more, nothing less. It's just a question of doing it until it's done. All right, so that's the blocking layer, and we're going to move straight on to lighting. Right, in this following part, I'm going to be showing you how to apply lighting and shading to your drawing. However, I'm going to show you quickly 2 different approaches to doing it. And for those of you who are newer to Photoshop, you might not be familiar with some of these different techniques. The first is to parent one layer to another, or to make a layer a child of another layer. And the second way is to create a mask. For this particular tutorial, I'm going to show you how we're going to be using the masking technique. However, I want to show you both, just in case you decide you want to work one way or another. Okay? So in order to do this, I'm going to show you how masks work first. A mask essentially is working with transparency. The Photoshop term for transparency, or any digital program, for instance, including 3D animation, is the term alpha. Alpha refers to transparency. When it comes to transparency, black, the color black, or the shade, the value black, is considered full transparency or full alpha, and white is considered zero alpha or full transparency. Okay, I'll show you exactly what I mean. I'm going to create a new layer, and on this layer, I'm going to create a mask. I'm going to connect a mask to this layer by clicking on this square button with the little white circle on it. Okay. When I click on that, you're going to notice that I've actually added a mask layer to this. Okay. Now, while this is selected, because you can select back and forth between your mask and your drawing area, if I select on my mask, and you'll notice that my foreground color is currently black, I'm going to paint a black line right across the middle. If you look very closely, you might be able to see a little black mark here as well on my mask. Now, if I click back on my drawing layer, you'll notice that my colors turn back to their actual colors, because when you're on a mask, it only reads in values of white and black and all the shades in between. Okay. When I click back on my drawing layer, it switches back to my colors. Now look what happens when I draw. That black line that I drew, is completely transparent. If I go back on my mask layer by clicking on it, and I switch to my background color, which is currently white, or my background value, sorry, because black and white aren't colors, they're values. If I hit X, X is an X-ray, I can start painting in. I can paint out my mask, basically. I can delete the mask by painting white over it. That's how I can make my mask disappear. If I flip back to X again, I start applying I start applying transparency to my mask. Now you'll notice at this point that if I actually go back on my drawing layer, I move to the Move tool, and I move the drawing around, the mask is moving with it. Okay. If I wanted to, let's say, move the drawing but keep the mask where it was, you'll notice that between my drawing and my mask, I have a little chain link here. If I click on that chain link, I'll disconnect the connection between the two. Now if I click on my drawing, I can actually move my drawing without moving the mask. So let's say I wanted the transparency to be there. Once I'm happy, I click between the two again, which links them again, and now they'll move together once again. Now in the case of my drawing, how I'm going to actually use the mask tool to paint in the lighting and shading, so I'm going to create a new layer. Let's say I'm going to have my drawing that's here. I'm going to create a new layer on top of that. And then I'm going to want to mask out everything that's not this drawing. I want everything else to be masked, so that when I paint over, the only area that's going to be painted over is going to be the area within this red. So I'm going to go create a new layer, a transparent layer. There's nothing on it. And I'm going to hold down Control. And if you look at Control, when I float over my drawing area, you'll notice that I'll get a little marquee selection icon with the hand. If I let go of Control, you'll see that disappears. And if I click here, it's going to select the active area of this drawing. Okay. You will, however, notice that because this area is faded out, it's not as sharp and bright, that it didn't quite select this area. Now that might not necessarily mean that I won't be able to paint there. Let's see. Okay. On my new layer, with this selection made, I'm going to hit the mask tool. And what that does is it automatically masks out everything that's not this active area here. Okay, you'll notice even if you look closely, I have a little dot there. It's hard to see because it's small. I'm going to click back on my drawing layer, because if I'm on my mask layer and I draw, I'm only going to be painting in mask, right? I have to go back onto my drawing layer, and here I'm going to switch to my background color, which is currently blue, by hitting X. Now if I paint, it'll only paint in the area that's active here. Everything else is masked out. Now in this particular case, you'll notice that it didn't quite paint in this area, right? Didn't quite catch the mask, faded out on this area because it wasn't as opaque as the rest of the paint. That can be a disadvantage of working this way. So just be aware of it. However, in my particular case, because I created a sharp-edged image with the way we did our blocking, we're not really gonna face that problem as much. It's not as much of an issue. But just be aware of the disadvantage of working with a mask if this is the case. If I wanted to fix that, I'd have to physically go into my mask, select white, and physically paint it in. Okay, like that. Okay. So that's one way of doing it. So this way, when I apply shading, which I'll show in more detail in just a moment, this is a quick way of doing it without going over the lines. Now, the alternative to that is to parent one layer to another. And the way I do that is this is my active drawing layer. I'm going to create a new layer, and then I'm going to hold down Alt and click between these two layers. You'll notice that if my cursor goes over the line between these two layers, the cursor actually changes to this different icon. Okay. If I'm between these two layers with Alt held down and I click, it's going to make this layer a child of this layer. And what that essentially means is when I paint on this layer, the only area that's going to appear, the only area that's going to be visible that I paint is going to be the area that is connected to active pixels on the layer beneath it. So it's only going to paint over pixels that are active on its parent layer. This is the parent layer. I can actually create several layers and connect them all. I can make all of these layers children to this. So if on this layer, let's say I paint blue, and this layer I paint green, and on this layer I'm going to paint yellow, like that. I can show and hide each one of these individual layers at my discretion. However, if I hide my parent layer, I hide everything because all of these layers are dependent on the parent. Okay? It's the same type of term you would hear in 3D animation when you're parenting one bone to another to create a skeleton. If, for instance, I'm creating an arm, then I'll start at the root bone. The parent bone might be my shoulder, and then the upper arm, forearm, and the hand, and all of the fingers all the way to the fingertip are all children of that main bone. Okay, they're all dependent on that main bone in sequence. Well, it's the same idea when it comes to parenting layers. Now, the advantage of parenting one layer to another is that when I paint over it, it can accurately fill all of the pixels underneath. The disadvantage, however, when you work this way is the fact that if I want to, let's say I had this set, let Photoshop is thinking for a second here. Let's give it a second. Yeah. Let's see if it's going to crash on us. No, there we go. Okay. If, let's say this was set down to 50%. Now, right now, that blue is partially hidden. It's actually blending with the other color underneath to create this purple color, right? Now, if I wanted to select that blue because I wanted to paint other areas of this painting, well, I can't do so by just clicking on this layer, right? Because if I do, I'm going to actually select purple. That's not what I want. So how do I do it? Well, if I wanted to hide all of the other layers but that blue layer, so that I could do a quick select of that color, I can't do so by clicking directly on this child layer, because if I do so, because this child layer is dependent, it's connected to the parent layer, it doesn't hide the parent layer. So I'm still got that purple there. That's not working. That's not where I want to be. So the only way to do it, the order you have to do it is to unparent it, then hold down Alt and click on the eyeball. When you hold down Alt and click on the eyeball, you're making every layer but that layer visible. Okay? You're hiding everything but that layer. So if I hold on Alt and I click, it's going to hide everything but that blue layer. I select my blue, then I have to re-show everything by holding down Alt and clicking on the eyeball again, and then reparenting it. And that's the only order you can do it in. That's the way it works. If I have 50 layers, for instance, and I make a mistake, and I accidentally make the wrong ones appear, then I have to manually go in and make and re-show every single one of those layers, which can be a pain in the butt sometimes. So you just have to be aware of that. Once you've done that, then you can reparent it like that. Okay, you can reparent this layer to it as such. Okay, it's the only way you can do it. And then you can keep painting in that color to make the purple. Okay. That's the disadvantage when you're working with a mask, however. The advantage of working with a mask is if I create a new layer, I create my selection by holding down Control and clicking on the layer underneath. Then I create my mask, and then I click back on my drawing layer and I draw. And then I set this opacity down to 50% to create this purple. Now, if I want to select just that blue color, then all I have to do is hold down Alt, click, Alt, click, and we're good. And now I can keep working. That's the advantage of working with a mask. So remember, there's two different ways of going about it. However, for this particular painting, as you can see, I created a sharp blocking that has a nice sharp edge to it, so I'm going to be able to use the mask tool effectively without causing any problems. Now that we understand masking and how I'm going to be organizing my layers, I'm going to show you how we're going to apply this mask to apply lighting and shading. And it's a step-by-step process. It's a layered process. So basically, we're going to create new layers, and as we do, we're going to be building up light and shading. Okay. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to create a new layer between my line layer and my blocking layer. So this is my line layer. This is my blocking layer. I'm going to create a new one. And then I'm going to Control click to do an automatic selection of the active pixels on my blocking layer. And I'm going to click on my mask, as I showed you in the last part. And remember, it's always important to click on the drawing layer. Otherwise, you're going to be painting on the mask and it's going to be frustrating. You know the deal. Now for this first pass, all I want to do is establish where my light source is coming from. A very quick, very easy light pass. And to do so, I'm going to turn off shape dynamics. I'm going to hold down Shift and I'm going to hit my left bracket about 4 or 5 times to make it a soft edge brush. I'm going to turn down my hardness. And you'll notice here as well, that I turn my opacity and flow way down. I want to work softly. So 30 and 20, you can 40 and 20, whatever works for you. Okay. And for this, I just want to establish that my light is coming from the top left like this. And I'm going to respect the fact that I have 3-dimensional forms here. Okay. So here I'm just going to go very quickly and paint in this lighting like that. I'm just going to do a very quick light pass with a large brush, very loose. Okay, like that. That's it. And once that's done, I'm going to take the opacity down because you're going to notice that I want to work very subtly and slowly build things up. So I just want to have that suggestion of a light source. That's all I need. But I don't want it to be a strong transition between light and dark. I want to build that up gradually. So to do that, this is where I actually change my brush setting. And I'm going to keep it at this new brush setting throughout the rest of this lighting phase. Okay. I'm in the brush tool. I'm going to create a new layer. Now I can either Control click on this layer or I can Control click on the mask because the mask is the same selection, right? And on this new layer, I'm going to create a mask just like I just did. However, my brush settings, I'm going to set my hardness back up and I'm going to turn my shape dynamics on. I'm going to keep my opacity and flow very low because I want to work gently. I can even go down as low as 20 and 20 if I want to, or 20 and 10. And here, I'm going to start breaking apart these shapes to start defining all of the different bumps and surface variations on this bark, right? You'll notice as well that I'm working with a large brush, larger than the actual surface that I'm going to be drawing on. The reason for this being is when you work softly if you're painting in using this technique, you'll find that if you work with a small brush and you want to work gently, it's going to only paint a tiny little line. I want to actually be able to make the transition between fat and thin surfaces. So as I start on my first pass, I'm going to use a large brush and I'm just going to paint in very loosely. I might even go larger than that. Very loosely, I'm going to start breaking apart. You notice I'm creating a separation between this area and this area. Okay. Same thing down here. I'm going to break these apart slowly. I'm always respecting my light source. Okay, I'm working very subtly. For this area where I want to capture these variations in these shapes, I'm going to have to work with a smaller brush. So I'm going to bring my brush down. I'm going to apply a bit of lighting here. Break apart some of these shapes like that. Maybe a little bit of light's going to capture off this inside here. And once that's done, like I did with the last pass, I'm going to take the opacity of this layer down. I want it to blend gently. I'm just starting to suggest it. Here, I might actually be able to take my original light pass down a little bit, just so we can see that transition a little bit more. Again, rinse and repeat. New layer, select, create a mask, click on my drawing layer, and here I'm going to break these new shapes apart even further. Okay? Now, it might be a bit sloppy because I'm doing this fast. I just want to demonstrate how this is done, right? I'm going to put a little bit more care and attention to it as I do my actual painting. And here I'm actually going to start breaking apart these shapes. Oh, I think I went a little bit too far with this one here. Let's go backtrack. I'm doing Control-Alt-Z to do multiple undos because I actually want to break it apart further. So I want to start creating some transitions. There we go. There we go. And I'm going to keep working this way. I'm going to break these shapes apart like that. Okay. It's a bit sloppy, I notice, as you may concur. However, because I want to, in order to make this brush stroke feeling disappear and have it blend in a little bit more, again, it's important that I bring the opacity down again. And you'll notice that it blends in a little bit better that way. There we go. And I'm going to keep doing that for the light pass, I generally feel between 3 and 5 passes are the best, okay? Because you want to keep building it up until you reach a point where you feel that it's starting to feel like specularity. The surface is starting to look too shiny. Now, if I'm actually working on a shiny surface, let's say this tree was wet, it was raining outside, then I might want to build up my values even further to create more of a shiny, high reflective surface. But in this case, it's a regular matte surface tree trunk, right? And you notice that every time I apply more light to it, I'm going to break these shapes apart even further, like that. Okay. I'm going to bring the opacity down just enough so that it blends in, but I still want it to remain visible. If I do feel, by the way, like in certain areas, you notice like here, I'm not crazy about the fact that this brush stroke looks a little bit sloppy, then I can go into my eraser tool. I can set the opacity and flow down low as well, like 30 and 20. I would probably make it a soft brush just so I can gently come in and clean that up a little bit. I want to hide I want it to fall off to be a little bit smoother. Okay, you can just correct it a little bit. Now I'm going to do that about 4 or 5 times for the lighting, but I'm also going to do the same thing for the shading. So I'm going to create a new layer just like I did, create a selection, mask it, click on my drawing layer. Here I'm going to select my blocking value, and I'm going to bring it down even further. I try to avoid black if I can. But I can't. I'm not always successful with that. Sometimes I have to go black in order for that to appear. I'm going to turn off shape dynamics for the first pass, make it a soft brush, and here I'm just going to establish my shading source. You notice my opacity and flow is still set very low. Okay, actually I think I can turn it up to 30% opacity because it's taking a little bit too long. And here I can establish where my shadow source is, and of course, just like I did with the lighting, I'm going to bring down the opacity. New layer, select, mask, click on my drawing layer, go back to hardness, turn my shape dynamics on, and exactly like I did with my lighting, I'm going to start breaking apart these shapes in the shading as well. Okay. So I'm building up the shadows and I'm building up the light as well. And as I do, you're going to notice that I'm going to start bringing out these nice forms are going to start to appear as we build them up. It's a very enjoyable painting process. Now you're going to have to get used to using the brush this way. You might be unfamiliar with it, but it's a very enjoyable way of painting, watching your forms really come to life. And not only that, but because you're visualizing these shapes, many of these shapes are visualized in your own mind because you're looking at these basic shapes and you're breaking them apart. You're actually starting to find forms and shapes appear in front of your eyes, which is a nice experience as well. I enjoy this. Okay. Now, lighting, I generally find 3 to 5 passes. I usually 4 to 5 passes are necessary. For shading, I only find 2 or 3 are necessary. I don't usually go much further than that. Okay, so just be aware of that. And once that's done, you'll notice that I can actually hide the layer on top, and I already have a very solid idea of these forms. I might not necessarily need my line layer, and you might also find that sometimes in order to do your lighting and shading effectively, sometimes it's necessary to hide your line layer just to make sure that you did it properly, that it looks nice. Okay, and that's it. That's how we're going to do it. Now you're going to watch it unfold in front of you. You're going to watch how we actually do it. I'm going to do it time lapsed, and I might skip ahead a little bit just because it's a long process. I have a lot of tree to paint in here like this, but you understand the process. So let's watch it unfold.